listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. Our guest today is Sam Friedman, an associate professor of sociology at the London School of Economics and a member of the British government's Social Mobility Commission. Sam Friedman, welcome to the podcast. What does social mobility currently look like in the UK, and what are the impediments you found?
So, social mobility in the UK is at best stagnant and at worst has been falling over the last 20 or 30 years. Those views depend on whether you're an economist or a sociologist. If you're an economist and you study income mobility, so the link between your parents' income and your own, then it looks like social mobility has been declining, which is causing a lot of anxiety to politicians. Sociologists like myself, we study class mobility. So that looks at the occupation of your main breadwinning parent and then compares the movement between that and your own occupation in a set of socioeconomic classes. Our research looks at the kind of top echelons of the UK workforce, elite occupations, higher managerial and professional occupations. And we were particularly interested in how your class background affects your ability to get into those occupations, but then also to get on in those occupations, to get to the top of British society, which is a kind of a slightly different question to the overall question of how socially fluid or open a society is, but we think kind of really captures an important element of this kind of American dream idea or kind of myth of meritocracy.
You have that in the UK too.
We very much have a very similar belief, and it's very powerful, and most surveys of attitudes in the UK show that people's belief in meritocracy is very high. People believe that hard work is the main determinant of what gets you ahead. And so we really wanted to kind of test that. And the interesting thing that we found initially looking at large-scale representative survey data was not only do people from working-class backgrounds tend not to enter those occupations, but most interestingly, really, in terms of new research, we found that when they do get into those occupations, and even when they do and they are meritocratically similar to their privileged colleagues in every way we can measure, they work the same level of hours, they have the same level of training, they have the same level of educational attainment, they still go on to earn significantly less, 16% less than their colleagues who have come from upper middle class backgrounds. And that, I think, caused a lot of waves in the UK. I think it really sort of busted a lot of people's sort of long-held beliefs that, we may have issues in relation to access to these types of occupations that's very much to do with the type of starting points people have in life. But, once you get into law, medicine, it's a level playing field. And this really kind of opened that up.
And why wasn't it a level playing field?
Yeah, so to get at that, we wanted to go beyond large-scale survey data. We kind of felt we needed to get into the lived experience of career progression in these sorts of occupations. So we brokered access to a number of elite firms. We went behind the closed doors at a large multinational accountancy firm, one of Britain's biggest television broadcasters, an architecture practice. We also spoke to some actors to try and see what life was like outside of firms. And that really, I suppose, doing that, and we carried out about 175 interviews in the end with people from a range of different backgrounds in these firms. This kind of brought out a number of what you might call drivers of this class ceiling or class pay gap in the UK. So the first one, fairly straightforwardly, is about economic capital and what we call in the UK, I'm not sure if you have the same saying here, the bank of mum and dad.
We have mums and dads here.
So basically, this is the idea that really, when we looked at people's career trajectories, the speed of those career trajectories and how far they'd got, what you found was when you spoke to people from privileged backgrounds, very often in the background of those trajectories had been the bank of mum and dad, providing this kind of form of financial insulation from a lot of the uncertainty associated with forging those careers, allowing them to make all sorts of decisions that often had long-term payoffs for their career. You know, maybe take that uncertain or short-term role, spend more time on networking, these sorts of things. Whereas those from working class backgrounds who didn't have that financial safety net often grudgingly had kind of self-selected out of the most sort of prestigious or lucrative area or specialty within their profession and had gone for something more financially secure. And so you kind of think about that might be seen as a sort of choice, but actually it was very much a choice under duress, and very much linked to that element of having money behind you, not just accessing money, but the psychological possibility that it's there if you need it.
Right.
The second thing we found was this idea of sponsorship. So we kind of often think about the power of networks in careers as kind of often in sociology, this idea of the power of weak ties, of kind of networking in a kind of superficial, fleeting kind of way. What was interesting was that when we spoke to people who had got to the very top of these careers, and they narrated their trajectories, very often there was actually a very small number of individuals, maybe 2 or 3, who had been pivotal in their ascent. And normally those individuals, and this in some ways is the key point, operating underneath the kind of formal mechanisms of the business, had self-consciously fast-tracked their career, had advocated on their behalf, had brokered job opportunities for them.
And why doesn't this happen with people from working class backgrounds?
Yeah, so to try and understand that, we kind of went back to the genesis of these sponsor relationships. So what ingredient transforms your normal everyday working relationship into a bond worthy of sponsorship? Lots of people in interviews, when asked that question, would say, well, it was about talent. I saw that this person was talented. But when you actually ask them more specifically about how they'd met, and you know what that had first drawn them to that person, in reality, or you actually found that it was very rarely work performance, and much more often something about sort of cultural commonality, sharing taste, sharing humor, sharing recreational interests. And the point, I suppose, for us is that because those from privileged backgrounds overwhelmingly dominate the upper echelons of these businesses, this idea of sponsorship in your own image, which is what we were very much seeing, then acts as another mechanism generally that advantages the already privileged. Now, it's not to say that it's only the privileged that do this type of sponsorship. We found instances in some cases where, you know, it was those from working class backgrounds at the top doing the same. So I don't think it's something about people from privileged backgrounds that they're more devious or more likely to show favoritism, but it's that they're more likely at the moment, and as a result, those sponsorship networks are acting to perpetuate this class ceiling.
So it's about having a certain type of cultural capital.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in that instance, I think it's really just about this idea of what we call in sociology homophily, just, you know, birds of a feather flock together, that you feel comfortable, secure around people like yourselves, and that acts as the glue that sort of bonds people together. And I think the key point in a way there is to think about, well, there's nothing untoward about that in some ways. And I don't think we're ever going to stop people making strong relationships with people like themselves at work. But what you can stop is you can prevent senior individuals from circumventing formal procedures in order to advocate on behalf of their favourites. And I think that's really more where the issue lies in terms of that mechanism. The other kind of key one that came out, which it'd be interesting to hear whether you think these kind of things also play out in a US context. But
that was something I was going to ask you.
But what we found in a lot of these elite occupations is that there's a kind of behavioral code about how to be in the workplace, about how you kind of fit in, if you will. And what we found is that really those codes are kind of the historical legacy of who's done this type of work in the past. Traditionally, in a UK context anyway, almost overwhelmingly white privileged men. And the idea, I suppose, is that over time, those people have been able to kind of embed their own ideas about the right way to be in the workplace. And those in the present continue to kind of govern fairly taken for granted assumptions about how everyone then within an organization or profession thinks about what's appropriate to do, to say, to dress, and all of these sort of elements of self-presentation. And I suppose what we were seeing then was that those from working class backgrounds coming into these professions had this fairly bewildering job of trying to sort of assimilate, acculturate into these behavioral codes around accent, around dress, around all elements of self-presentation, really, that kind of involved them having to almost shed their class identities. And that really, in most of the narratives that we got from these sort of people, they felt sort of fairly bewildered by, and that they were kind of systematically failing at in some way. And I suppose the point for us about these behavioral codes is, although they tended to be sort of very much valued by those at the top of these professions, when you kind of come back and sort of think, well, do they have any sort of relationship to intelligence or work performance? That relationship, to us anyway, seemed very very unclear. You know, why in any way should somebody's accent denote anything about their ability to do the job well? And yet, in a UK context anyway, it's still incredibly powerful that you speak a certain way in order to be seen as the right sort of person to...
Right. And something like that seems so subtle that it would not be amenable to a kind of policy fix the way you could implement a progressive economic policy that can give people maybe a basic income, and then they could overcome the bank of mom and dad problem. But you couldn't do that with these cultural codes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really tough one, and we've been working actually with a number of the case study organizations on precisely this question. How do you tackle these elements of organizational culture that tilt towards or tilt in favor of certain groups? I think in a way the starting point needs to be, well, let's have an open conversation about what talent or merit looks like in this space. And I think, what we were finding is that currently lots of people in organizations, particularly in junior grades, very much disagree with what those at the top value on these sorts of grounds, but for fairly obvious reasons don't feel emboldened to voice that contestation in everyday life. What you need, I suppose, is to create a space organizationally where you can voice that concern and there won't be ramifications for your own career, but that also you perhaps start to kind of get those people to understand or to realize that these sorts of things that they value aren't widely agreed upon. And I think, if you can get a more widely agreed upon idea of what merit or talent looks like, then I think you're likely to have a fairer and a more harmonious environment.
Well, it sounds to me like none of this is specific to the UK, but do you think that it's applicable to the situation in the United States?
I mean, I'm fascinated by that question, and I mean, it's an empirical question that I'd love to do research on. There has been some great studies in the US on on some of these sorts of things. Lauren Rivera at Northwestern wrote a great book on kind of getting into top firms and the power of cultural capital there. So I think some of it does apply. I think there are perhaps some particularities to the embodied nature of class identities in the UK that I think are particularly powerful and that perhaps are less acute here in terms of those behavioral codes.
Could you give me an example?
Well, even accent, right? I mean, in the UK,
We have accents.
You have accents, and I understand that those accents are classed,
Mm-hmm.
but there also doesn't appear to be in the same way a more neutral American accent appears to be fairly geographically spread and cuts across a number of sort of middle and upper middle classes. In the UK, there are sort of gradations of accent that are so subtle and can be, and most people can identify almost immediately.
And where does your accent fall?
I am in the solidly privileged group.
But not the highest possible group.
Not the highest possible.
Could you do an impression of what that would sound like?
That would mean a little bit like this.
Oh, yeah, I was impressed.
I mean,
yes.
you've got lots of good examples if you want from the royal family, which I'm sure you know. There's a sort of Meghan
Markle.
Yeah, she's doing the assimilation, right? She's trying desperately, but you know, even she is a good example of, you know, it's a sort of different layer of that sort of upward mobility, but she's having to assimilate, and you're seeing.
Has she changed the way she speaks?
You know, I'm not enough of a royal observer.
Yeah, neither am I.
But I think, you know, you probably will find almost certainly if you compare her accent maybe in 5 to 10 years and you compare it to before she met Harry, I'm sure there will be a difference. And I'm sure she will be expected, you know, I mean, you sort of see a sort of a more like physically sort of erect sort of embodiment that comes with that very extreme form of privilege that you can kind of see in a number of them. That it's all of these elements I think are fascinating, and although I think they do play out in a US context, perhaps not quite as powerfully.
Well, maybe your next study can look at that. But the last question I wanted to ask you is, why is increasing social mobility the desired policy goal as opposed to, say, leveling class distinctions altogether through kind of downward redistribution?
Yeah, this is a key question. So increasing social mobility isn't, for me, the overall goal. I think you and you can never. I mean, so I sit at the moment on something called the UK Government Social Mobility Commission, which in its sort of entity is devoted to doing exactly what you just mentioned there, partly because it's a politically very palatable sort of policy goal across different political stripes. I'm sure it's to some extent the same here. The American dream is kind of shared. But I think where you then get the political distinctions is kind of what comes alongside the sort of idea of social mobility. And for me, you know, you can't really think about social mobility without thinking about inequality, and that a lot of the pernicious elements of social mobility. So, for example, what we see in our study is that often people who are upwardly socially mobile, the supposed winners of meritocracy, right? They often have quite difficult journeys, and it's partly because they're asked to travel so far culturally, because the distinctions between social classes are so wide because of inequality, that their sense of identity tends to be a bit dislocated, and their experience is often quite emotionally turbulent. And I think that in a society where the rungs on the ladder are closer together, the heat that surrounds this sort of ideal of meritocracy and the sort of currency of meritocracy starts to be less acute. And I think that's in some ways where we should be aiming for, in a way.
So you're endorsing Jeremy Corbyn.
I'm a soft Corbynista. So I have to be a bit careful because I'm on this Social Mobility Commission, so I'm officially apolitical. But I think that on these sorts of topics, he has an understanding of how, in some ways, actually pernicious the social mobility discourse can be if not connected to inequality. Because without connecting it, social mobility becomes a sort of a way of justifying inequality. So as long as we can have as literally as high inequality as we like, and that's fine.
As long as one guy can get up there.
Exactly, and then we fetishize those individuals, and it perpetuates this dream that it's possible, and I think that can be really dangerous. So I think for me, as I said, it's about keeping those things in mind. And the goal is an open society where people can move up and down, but there's also a society where there's not a stigma about deciding for whatever reasons you don't want to be upwardly socially mobile. And I think at the moment, certainly if you're in a working class community in the UK, there is a sense that if you decide that you want to follow in your parents' footsteps into a working class job, then society puts a stigma on that as some sense of personal failure, and I think that's wrong.
I agree with you. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and good luck with Brexit.
Thank you. We'll need it.